Maggie Thornfield never thought her life could collapse into something as small as a courthouse bathroom and a school bus. At 42, she had once lived the kind of life people admired from a distance: a polished marketing career, a beautiful suburban home, a husband from the right family, and the illusion of stability wrapped in expensive curtains. Then, in one brutal season, it all vanished. The divorce stripped her bare. Her ex-husband kept the power. His family kept the money. And Maggie was left standing in the rain with her 11-year-old daughter, Iris, one manila envelope of legal papers, and exactly $847 to start over. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was the first crack where light got in. Because when every safe option disappeared, Maggie made a choice no one would have called wise. She bought a broken-down school bus that smelled like mildew and diesel and turned it into the only home she and Iris had left. Everyone who looked at them saw failure. A woman discarded. A child displaced. A life reduced to metal walls and desperation. But hidden inside that bus was something older and stronger than shame: a recipe book from Maggie's grandmother, a gift for baking she had never fully claimed. And the beginning of a second life no one saw coming. The courthouse steps were slick with rain when Maggie walked out holding Iris's hand and the envelope that had just reduced her future to paperwork. Behind her, the Ashworth family moved toward their Mercedes in a cluster of polished coats and satisfied silence. Then Victoria Ashworth turned back, lowered the car window, and delivered the final cut with the ease of someone who had never doubted her own cruelty. Some people just aren't cut out for the real world, Maggie. Then the car pulled away, spraying dirty water over Maggie's shoes. She stood there for one stunned second before guiding Iris into the courthouse bathroom, where fluorescent lights reflected off cracked mirrors and every sound seemed too loud. Maggie set her purse down, gripped the sink, and looked at a version of herself she barely recognized: mascara running, face hollow, shoulders bent not from age but from impact. Iris, only 11, quietly wet a paper towel and reached up to clean her mother's cheeks. That almost broke her more than the divorce had. Because while Maggie was trying not to fall apart, her daughter was already trying to hold her together. The bank was worse. Under the court order, their joint accounts were frozen down to a final release amount, $847. That was it. No apartment. No salary. No access to the home she had lived in. The lease had been in Robert's name. Her job at the family company had been eliminated while she sat in mediation. Even the locks had already been changed. By late afternoon, Maggie understood the truth with brutal clarity: this was not just heartbreak. It was financial erasure. The first nights after court were spent in the car. Maggie parked where she thought they might be ignored: behind big box stores, near 24-hour diners, in corners of lots where security might not notice two people trying to disappear. She reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, layered coats over Iris in the back, and stayed half awake listening for footsteps, flashlights, or a knock on the window that would force them to move again. Days were not much better. They washed in public restrooms, shared cheap meals in bookstores and fast food places where they could sit long enough without being asked to leave. Maggie searched apartment listings on her phone until the words blurred together. Every place required deposits she could not afford. Every possibility ended with some version of the same answer: not enough money, not enough time, not enough stability. Then, late one night, she found the bus listing. An old school bus for sale at a salvage yard. Faded yellow. Ugly. Cheap enough to be barely possible. It was the kind of purchase practical people would laugh at, which meant Maggie barely slept before going to see it. Up close, it was worse than the ad had promised: cracked windows, torn vinyl seats, the smell of mildew and diesel trapped in old metal. And yet, it ran. It had walls. It could move if they had to move. So Maggie did the only thing left that scared her more than staying still: she bought it. Not because it was a good option. Because it was the last one that belonged to them. That first night in the bus felt only slightly better than the car, but psychologically, it changed everything. A car was emergency. A bus, even a broken-down one, could become shelter. Maggie parked it behind an abandoned strip mall where overgrown bushes hid most of the vehicle from the road. As evening settled in, she and Iris climbed inside with their blankets, one overnight bag, a flashlight, and the fragile hope that at least tonight no one would tap on their window and tell them to move. The interior still smelled like mildew, old vinyl, and damp metal. Rainwater found its way through small leaks in the roof. The tiny bathroom in the back was functional in the loosest possible sense. But for the first time since court, they could stand up indoors. That mattered. Iris, with the instinct children have for rescuing moments adults are drowning in, looked around the dented yellow shell and said, "It's like camping." Maggie nearly cried from gratitude at the effort behind that sentence. The next days became about adaptation. Maggie bought reflective insulation, adhesive hooks, and a few basic supplies with what little money remained. They lined the walls, covered the windows at night, rearranged the least damaged seats into something like a living space. Maggie scavenged cushions, a small table, and discarded storage bins. Iris taped up little drawings to make the metal walls feel less temporary. Then Iris gave the bus a name. The Sunflower. Because sunflowers, she said, always turn toward the light. And in that leaking, awkward, improvised space, Maggie felt the first faint hint that maybe they could too. The recipe book came out on the fourth night in the bus. Maggie had packed it almost without thinking, tucking it into the bottom of her bag along with a few photographs and Iris's extra socks. It was old, leather-bound, and softened at the edges by decades of use. The pages smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla, as if her grandmother Rosalie had somehow pressed warmth directly into the paper. Inside were handwritten recipes, notes in the margins, and small pieces of advice that sounded less like instructions and more like survival whispered across generations. That night, after Iris had fallen asleep, Maggie sat under the weak glow of a battery light and turned the pages until she found a simple bread recipe. No eggs. No milk. Nothing expensive. Just flour, water, yeast, salt, and patience. The next morning, using their makeshift setup and a dented pot that barely deserved to be called cookware, Maggie mixed the dough. As her hands pressed and folded it, something inside her quieted for the first time in weeks. Kneading gave shape to all the panic and anger she had no words for. Push. Fold. Turn. Repeat. There was comfort in the rhythm, in doing something ancient and practical, something that turned basic ingredients into nourishment. When the bread finally baked, the bus filled with a smell so warm and human that Iris woke up smiling. "It smells like home," she whispered. Maggie looked at the small loaf cooling on a cracked tray and realized that was exactly what had changed. The bus was still cramped. They were still broke. But now, inside it, something living and hopeful had risen. Harold Whitmore entered their story because of the smell. It was early evening, and Maggie was standing over their makeshift setup, trying not to burn a batch of cinnamon rolls while also keeping the bus ventilated enough not to smoke them out. The sweet scent of yeast, butter, and cinnamon drifted out through the cracked window into the parking area beyond. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the bus door. Maggie froze. For one sharp second, she thought it might be security or someone coming to tell them they had overstayed their welcome yet again. But when she opened the door, she found not hostility, but an elderly man in a cardigan with silver hair, careful posture, and the kind of face that had spent a lifetime taking food seriously. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, "but whatever you're baking smells legitimate." That was Harold. He introduced himself as a retired pastry chef who lived nearby and admitted, with surprising directness, that the smell had lured him over like a memory. When Maggie awkwardly explained their situation, he did not flinch or offer pity. He simply asked where she was baking, what recipe she was using, and whether she had ever worked in a real kitchen before. Then he made an offer that felt almost suspicious in its generosity. He had a professional-grade kitchen he barely used. She could use it. In exchange, he asked only for a share of whatever she made. It was the first real door that had opened since the divorce, not charity, not rescue, but respect disguised as opportunity. Harold's kitchen changed everything because it introduced Maggie to a version of herself she had never been allowed to become. The first morning she walked into his apartment, she felt out of place immediately. The kitchen was immaculate, bright, and unmistakably professional, proper mixers, heavy pans, sharp knives, marble counters cool under her fingertips. It was not the kind of space where people guessed. It was the kind where they knew. Harold wasted no time pretending otherwise. He corrected how she held a rolling pin. Showed her how to judge dough by feel instead of fear. Explained why temperature mattered, why butter had to stay cold, why kneading was not punishment but communication. He was exacting, but never cruel. If Maggie made a mistake, he told her why. If she got something right, he made sure she understood that it was skill, not luck. And slowly, she began to trust her own hands. Iris found her place too. She measured ingredients, labeled containers, packed finished pastries, and watched Harold with the fierce concentration of a child who knows something important is happening. Before long, she was contributing ideas of her own, small flavor twists, decorative touches, names for things that sounded brighter and more hopeful than anything Maggie would have chosen alone. The kitchen became more than borrowed workspace. It became a classroom. A sanctuary. A place where Maggie stopped thinking of herself as a woman recovering from collapse and started becoming something else entirely, someone capable, someone teachable, someone good. Their first real customer arrived by accident. A police officer had pulled up beside the bus one morning to tell Maggie she could not stay parked where she was. His tone was not cruel, just procedural, the voice of someone doing a job while already half expecting resistance. Maggie braced herself for one more disruption, one more place they would have to leave. Then the officer stopped mid-sentence. "Is that cinnamon?" he asked. Inside the bus, a tray of still warm rolls was cooling by the window. Iris, who had already learned that fear and generosity sometimes occupy the same moment, offered him one before Maggie could stop her. The officer hesitated, took a bite, and everything changed. His face softened. He finished the roll in near silence, then asked the question Maggie had not dared imagine hearing. "How much would you charge for a dozen?" That afternoon, he came back with cash and a request from the station. A few days later, firefighters wanted some too. Then office workers. Then people who had heard, somehow, that there was a woman in a school bus making the kind of pastries that reminded grown men of their grandmothers and their better years. That was how Rosalie's Rolling Bakery was born. Not from branding strategy or ambition, but from one unexpected taste of something made with care. Iris made the first sign herself, decorating it with a bright sunflower and hand-lettered words that turned the bus from a shelter into an identity. Maggie taped it into the window and stood back, stunned by what it meant. They were no longer only surviving inside the bus. Now, they were serving from it. Once the first orders started coming in, Maggie and Iris stopped moving day to day and started building week to week. That difference mattered. A day-to-day life is all urgency. Where to park? What to eat? How to stretch the last few dollars? But a week-to-week life begins to hold shape. The police station wanted Friday cinnamon rolls. The firehouse asked for bread on Monday. A few regulars began placing repeat orders. Suddenly there was a schedule, and with the schedule came the first fragile feeling of stability. Harold deepened that shift by giving Maggie something he did not hand out lightly, his sourdough starter. He called it victory. It had been alive for decades, fed through seasons of war, grief, recovery, and work. Passing it to Maggie felt less like sharing an ingredient and more like entrusting her with a lineage. She accepted it with almost ceremonial care, and from then on victory became part of their daily rhythm, feeding, resting, rising, transforming. Iris treated it like a living pet and a family heirloom all at once. Together, mother and daughter began forming the kind of partnership neither of them had expected. Maggie handled the baking, but Iris became essential to everything else: packaging, signs, simple bookkeeping, customer warmth, and the creative energy that gave the business its personality. They learned to move around each other in tight spaces with instinctive coordination, each anticipating the other's next task. The bakery was growing. But something even more important was happening underneath it. Maggie and Iris were no longer just mother and child in crisis. They were becoming a team. The bakery changed overnight because one woman with a camera decided the story deserved to travel. Tilly Chen, a local food blogger with a sharp eye and a loyal following, discovered Rosalie's rolling bakery almost by accident. She came for the pastries, but stayed for the story, the school bus, the grandmother's recipes, the mother and daughter rebuilding their lives one loaf at a time. A few days later, her feature went live. By noon, everything was different. Their website crashed. Their social media flooded. Customers were already waiting when Maggie pulled the bus into its usual spot, some holding up phones with Tilly's article open, others driving in from towns Maggie had never even marketed to. The line stretched farther than Maggie could see from the service window. By mid-morning, they were sold out. The article called their sunshine rolls unforgettable. It called Maggie resilient. It called the bakery a miracle on wheels. And for the first time, the world outside their little circle agreed. That was when the past came back. Victoria Ashworth arrived in a polished car, Robert beside her, both wearing the same stunned expression people get when they realize the person they dismissed has become undeniable. They watched the line. They watched the customers. They watched Maggie moving with calm authority inside the life they never imagined she could build without them. Victoria tasted a pastry in silence. Then, quietly, she admitted it was extraordinary. Maggie did not need revenge in that moment. Standing beside the bus with customers waiting and Iris smiling through the service window, she already had something better: proof. Success created a new kind of pressure. For months, Maggie had been fighting simply to survive, one shift, one batch, one parking spot at a time. But once the bakery went viral, survival was no longer the problem. Capacity was. They were selling out constantly, turning away customers, and working themselves toward exhaustion trying to meet demand with borrowed kitchen time, limited storage. And a bus that could not physically hold the future people were suddenly asking them to build. That was when the bigger offers arrived. Business advisors wanted meetings. Small business offices called. People who had ignored or pitied them before now spoke the language of expansion, scale, and brand potential. At first Maggie distrusted all of it. She had only just rebuilt her footing. The idea of taking on debt, signing contracts, or tying her future to anyone powerful again made something in her body tighten. Then came the call from New York. A respected restaurateur had seen their story, tasted the products through a brokered delivery, and wanted to meet. Not to buy them out, but to discuss partnership, a real bakery in Brooklyn, living space above it, the bus remaining part of the brand instead of something to be hidden. It was the kind of opportunity Maggie once might have dismissed as impossible. Now it felt dangerous for a different reason. It was real. And that was what unsettled her most. Because surviving disaster is one thing. Stepping into the life beyond it is another. For the first time since the divorce, Maggie was no longer asking, "How do we get through this?" She was asking, "What if we're meant to become even more?" Brooklyn did not feel real until the bus was parked outside the bakery and Maggie saw their name on the window. Rosalie's Rising. Not a dream. Not a maybe. Not a viral moment people would forget in 2 weeks. A real place with ovens, counters, display cases, and an apartment above it where she and Iris could finally sleep without wondering who might knock on the door in the night. The move east was not graceful. It was long, exhausting, and full of logistical chaos. The bus groaned under the miles. The city overwhelmed them at first. The streets were tighter, the pace faster, and everything cost more than seemed reasonable. But when they stepped into the renovated bakery space and smelled fresh paint, wood, and possibility, Maggie felt something she had not felt since before the divorce. Arrival. They kept the bus. It stayed parked beside the bakery like a monument to where they had started, painted bright and impossible to ignore. Customers loved it. So did Maggie. It reminded her that nothing about this success had come from ease. The opening day was packed. Harold flew in. Mrs. Chen sent flowers. Detective Sullivan mailed a handwritten card. Even Victoria Ashworth appeared quietly, waited in line, and apologized in the only language she seemed capable of, awkwardly, without flourish, but sincerely enough to matter. By nightfall, the bakery had sold through almost everything. Maggie stood in the center of it all, flour on her apron, Iris laughing beside her, the city buzzing beyond the windows, and understood that what they had built was no longer temporary. It was home. A year earlier, Maggie had stood in the rain outside a courthouse with $847, an 11-year-old daughter, and no idea where they would sleep. Now she stood above a bakery built from the same hands that once shook in that courthouse bathroom, looking down at warm light spilling across Brooklyn pavement. Customers leaving with boxes in their arms, and the bus that had once saved them parked proudly below like a witness. That was the truth of it. The bus had never been the end of her story. It had been the bridge. Grandma Rosalie's recipe book had done more than feed them. It had carried wisdom across generations, reminding Maggie that starting over was not a mark of failure, but sometimes the hidden ingredient that finally lets a life rise. What began as bread in a broken school bus became work, then dignity, then community, then a future. And that is what her story proves. Being left with nothing is not the same as being nothing. A life can collapse and still contain the seed of something extraordinary. A woman can lose the house, the marriage, the job, the approval of everyone who once judged her, and still build something richer with her own hands. Maggie did not get her old life back. She built a better one.